A grandma secretly fed a homeless man every day. One afternoon, 3 Mercedes pulled up to her home. Enjoy the story. The pale winter light filtered through the threadbare curtains, casting long shadows across Clara Whitman's tiny apartment in Brooklyn. At 73, her hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they moved with practiced precision as she packed the day's meals. One simple sandwich wrapped in wax paper for herself, and one container of still steaming beef stew carefully sealed and wrapped in a threadbare dish towel. She tucked both into her faded canvas tote, the one her son Thomas had given her before he'd moved to Seattle 15 years ago. The calls had grown less frequent over the years until they'd become perfunctory. Birthday and Christmas exchanges? Clara understood. People had their own lives to lead. As she wrapped the warm container, she caught her reflection in the small mirror beside her refrigerator. Time had etched deep lines around her eyes and mouth, and her once auburn hair had faded to a silvery grey that she kept in a simple bun. Her sweater, patched at the elbows more times than she could count, hung loosely on her diminishing frame. The weight of loneliness was a physical thing, pressing down on her shoulders, curving her spine inch by inch with each passing year. But something brightened in her pale blue eyes as she checked the clock. 7:30. Time to go. Clara slipped on her worn coat, carefully buttoned it against the February chill, and picked up her tote bag. No one paid attention to an old woman shuffling down the street. She had become as invisible as the cracks in the sidewalk, as unremarkable as the peeling paint on the buildings she passed. And that was exactly why she could do what she did. 2 blocks down, 1 block east, into the narrow alleyway behind. What had once been a prosperous textile factory, now just another abandoned building, awaiting redevelopment. Clara's breath clouded in the cold morning air as she approached the makeshift shelter of cardboard and blue tarp. A figure stirred beneath the layers of blankets and newspapers. "Good morning, Robert," she called softly. "I've brought breakfast." The man emerged slowly from his cocoon, his beard matted and grey, his eyes roomy but kind. Those eyes had once reminded Clara of her late husband Frank's, intelligent eyes that had seen too much of the world's harshness. "Mrs. Clara," he acknowledged with a nod that carried the dignity of a gentleman despite his circumstances. "You shouldn't trouble yourself." "Nonsense," she replied, setting the container beside him and pulling a plastic spoon from her pocket. "It's no trouble at all. Eat while it's still warm." His weathered hands, cracked from exposure, carefully took the container. "You're a blessing, you know that? When everyone else looks through me like I'm a ghost, you see me." Clara's throat tightened. "We're all worthy of being seen, Robert." As he ate, she noticed the new tear in his glove, the way he winced when he moved his left leg. Another hard night on the streets of New York, where the cold was as merciless as the indifference of passers-by. "I'll bring an extra blanket tomorrow," she promised, patting his shoulder gently before turning to leave. "God bless you, Mrs. Clara," Robert called after her, the warmth in his voice a contrast to the biting cold of the alley. Back in her apartment, Clara eased into her threadbare armchair, massaging her aching joints. Her social security check barely covered rent and utilities, let alone proper food and medicine. The doctor had prescribed medication for her arthritis months ago, but she'd never filled it. Those pills or Robert's meals, it wasn't really a choice at all. She glanced at the framed photo of Frank on the side table. 20 years gone, but the hole he'd left still gaped wide some days. "You'd have done the same," she whispered to his smiling face. Frank had always been the first to help a neighbor, to offer a ride, to share what little they had. A sharp knock at the door startled her. Clara rarely had visitors. She rose slowly, making her way across the worn carpet. "Mrs. Whitman?" A young woman in a crisp suit stood in the hallway, clipboard in hand. "I'm Jessica Moore from Eastside Development." I'm here to discuss the building's upcoming renovation and your relocation options. Clara's heart sank to her worn slippers. Relocation. The woman's professional smile never wavered. The entire block has been acquired for luxury condominiums. Construction begins in 60 days. But don't worry, we have several affordable senior housing options available in Queens and the Bronx. Clara clutched the doorframe for support. But this is my home. I've lived here for 45 years. I understand it's difficult, Jessica said, not understanding at all. But progress is inevitable. Here's my card. The relocation package includes moving expenses and the first month's rent at one of our partner facilities. After Jessica left, Clara sank back into her chair, the relocation packet heavy in her hands. Queens or the Bronx, miles from here, miles from Robert. Who would bring him warm food then? Who would notice if he disappeared? That night Clara couldn't sleep. The thought of leaving her neighborhood, her routines, her purpose, pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. And beneath it all lay a deeper fear. In a new place, would she too finally become truly invisible? The next morning, Clara packed Robert's meal with extra care, adding a slice of the apple pie her neighbor Mrs. Goldstein had brought over. She would tell him about the building sale, about her impending relocation. Perhaps together they could figure something out. But when she arrived at the alley, the blue tarp was gone. The cardboard shelter had been dismantled. Robert's few possessions, the tattered backpack, the stack of newspapers, the plastic bucket he used to collect recyclables, all vanished. "Robert!" Clara called, her voice thin in the empty alley. "Robert!" A sanitation worker emptying trash at the far end glanced her way. "If you're looking for the homeless fella, cops cleared him out yesterday. New anti-loitering ordinance. They're cleaning up the neighborhood." He shrugged. "Progress, right?" Clara stood motionless, the warm container growing cold in her hands, as an emptiness greater than any she had known spread through her chest. Progress, a word that meant bulldozing not just buildings, but people. The invisible people no one else bothered to see. That afternoon, as Clara sat by her window watching the light fade from the winter sky, she made a decision. If the world insisted on making people like Robert invisible, then she would have to look harder, search farther. She would use these 60 days to find him again. The next morning began a new routine. Clara walked block after block, checking alleyways, park benches, and the steps of churches. She asked at shelters, soup, kitchens, and the public library where many homeless went to escape the cold. No one had seen a man matching Robert's description. Or perhaps they had, but he had been too invisible to notice. Days turned into weeks. Clara's legs ached from the unaccustomed walking, but she persisted. She continued to pack 2 meals each day, and when she couldn't find Robert, she would give the second meal to whoever she encountered who needed it. A young woman huddled under a bridge, an elderly man on a bench with all his possessions in a shopping cart, a teenager with hollow eyes who reminded her of what Thomas might have become, had life dealt him a different hand. These encounters both filled and emptied her. Each meal given was a connection made, however briefly. But none of them were Robert, and each day without finding him, the weight of her failure pressed down harder. Would anyone search for her this diligently if she disappeared? The question haunted her as she packed boxes in her increasingly bare apartment. Thomas had called when she told him about the relocation, offered to help her settle into a new place, even suggested she move to Seattle. But his life was there. His job, his friends, his routines that didn't include space for an aging mother. She declined as gently as she could. "I'll be fine," she'd assured him, a lie they both pretended to believe. On rainy Tuesday, as Clara made her way home from another fruitless search, a sleek black car pulled up beside her. The window lowered, revealing a middle-aged man in an expensive suit. "Mrs. Whitman?" he called. "Clara Whitman?" Clara clutched, her tote bag tighter, suddenly wary. "Who's asking?" The man stepped out of the car, opening an umbrella and extending it over her. "My name is David Maxwell. I believe you know my father, Robert." Clara's heart stuttered. "Robert Maxwell?" The man nodded, his expression grave. "He collapsed 3 days ago and was taken to Mount Sinai Hospital. When they admitted him, he had nothing but the clothes on his back and a small piece of paper with your name and this neighborhood written on it. It took some doing, but we found you." "Is he—" Clara couldn't finish the question. "He's alive," David assured her, "but he's been asking for you. Would you come with me?" Clara hesitated only a moment before nodding. As they drove through the rain-slicked streets, David explained in a voice tight with emotion. "My father was once a respected literature professor at Columbia. After my mother died 10 years ago, his depression spiraled. He started drinking, lost his job, his apartment. We tried to help, my sister and I, but he refused, said he'd failed. As a husband, a father, a man, one day he just disappeared. We searched for years before finally accepting he was gone, possibly dead." Clara listened, piecing together this new reality with the Robert she knew. The intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he spoke, his occasional references to Shakespeare and Steinbeck, it all made a sudden, heartbreaking sense. "3 weeks ago," David continued, "I got a call from a former colleague who thought he'd spotted my father near your neighborhood. I've been searching ever since, and then the hospital called." They arrived at Mount Sinai, where David led Clara through sterile corridors to a private room. There, amid machines and monitors, lay Robert, clean-shaven, his silver hair trimmed, but unmistakably the man from the alley. His eyes, sunken but clear, found Clara's immediately. "My guardian angel," he whispered, his voice stronger than she'd expected. "I knew you'd come." Clara moved to his bedside, taking his hand, no longer rough and chapped, but warm and familiar. "Nonetheless, I've been looking everywhere for you." "Pneumonia," Robert said with a weak gesture at the machines. "Years on the street finally caught up with me, but they tell me I'll recover." His eyes held hers. "They also tell me you've been feeding me for nearly 2 years." "It was nothing," Clara said, embarrassed by the gratitude in his gaze. "It was everything," Robert corrected. "You saw me when I couldn't even see myself." David cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitman, my father told us about your situation, the building sale, your impending relocation. I want you to know we've been discussing options. My sister and I own a small property management company. We have a vacant apartment in a building we manage on the Upper West Side. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable, and we'd like to offer it to you. Rent-controlled, indefinitely." Clara blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Robert interrupted, "let us help you the way you helped me. A life for a life." That evening, as Clara sat by Robert's bedside while he slept, David returned with his sister, Margaret. They brought dinner, listened to Clara's stories about their father, and shared their own. The hours passed in a blur of conversation and connection Clara hadn't experienced in years. "He told us how you brought food every day, no matter the weather," Margaret said, her eyes bright with emotion. "How you never asked questions, never judged." "How you saved his life," David added quietly. Clara shook her head. "I only brought food." "You brought dignity," Margaret corrected, "and that's what finally gave him the courage to let us help him." 2 weeks later, as Robert recovered in a rehabilitation facility, Clara moved into her new apartment, a 1-bedroom with large windows that flooded the space with light. The rent was a fraction of what it should have been, a family discount David had insisted upon. Her few possessions barely filled the space, but that quickly changed as Robert's family adopted her as their own. Margaret brought plants for the windowsills, David installed bookshelves and filled them with volumes Robert had once treasured and now wanted to share. Clara's days, once marked only by her solitary routine, now expanded to include visits to Robert in rehab, dinner with David's family, afternoon tea with Margaret and her teenage daughters. And when Robert was finally released, it was to an apartment just down the hall from Clara's. "We'll be neighbours," he'd said, with a warmth that made Clara's heart flutter in a way it hadn't in decades. "I can finally repay all those meals." As spring bloomed across the city, Clara and Robert began a new routine. Each morning they would share breakfast, then walk to the nearby park where Robert, leaning on a cane but growing stronger each day, would point out birds and recite snippets of poetry that matched the mood of the sky. In the evenings, they often dined with David or Margaret's families, or sometimes just the two of them would sit on Clara's small balcony, watching the city lights blink on as they shared stories of their separate journeys to this unexpected intersection. "I never thought I'd have this again," Robert confessed one evening, his hand finding Clara's in the gathering dusk. "A home, a family, a purpose." Clara squeezed his fingers gently. "Neither did I." That summer, with Robert's encouragement, Clara reached out to her son Thomas. Their first conversation was awkward, laden with unspoken regrets and missed connections. But it was a beginning. By fall, Thomas had visited twice, bringing his wife and 2 children Clara had only seen in photographs. The visits were tentative bridges being rebuilt, but they were bridges nonetheless. One crisp October day, as Clara and Robert walked arm in arm through the park's blazing autumn colors, Robert stopped beside a bench overlooking the pond. "I have something to ask you," he said, suddenly seeming nervous. "What is it?" Clara asked, concerned by his serious expression. Robert took both her hands in his. "David, Margaret and I have been talking. We're starting a foundation, the Visibility Project. We want to create programs that help the homeless not just with food and shelter, but with being seen as people. Again, dignity, connection, purpose." He paused. "We'd like you to help run it." Clara caught her breath. "Me? But I don't know anything about foundations or programs." "You know more than any of us about what it means to truly see someone," Robert said simply. "The rest we can figure out together." That winter, as the first snow fell over New York, the Visibility Project opened its doors 6 blocks from Clara and Robert's building. What had begun as one woman's daily act of kindness had blossomed into a community center that offered meals, shelter, medical care, job training, and most importantly, human connection to those who had become invisible on the city's streets. Clara, once so alone, now found herself surrounded by people, volunteers, staff, and those who came seeking help but stayed to give it as well. Her days were full in a way she hadn't experienced since Frank was alive. And at the center of it all was Robert, his health restored, his dignity reclaimed, his eyes bright with purpose as he taught literature classes to anyone who wanted to learn. Every morning, they still prepared 2 meals together before heading to the center, one for each of them, plus dozens more for those who came through their doors. And every evening they returned to their neighboring apartments, where the lights in the windows promised that neither would ever be invisible again. On a bright spring morning 1 year after Robert had collapsed in that alley, Clara stood at the podium during the Foundation's first anniversary celebration. Looking out at the gathered crowd, Robert's family, her son Thomas and his children, volunteers, donors, and those who had found their way back to visibility through their program. Clara felt a fullness in her heart that almost overwhelmed her. "Being seen is not a luxury," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "It's a human necessity. When we take the time to truly see one another, we don't just change a life, we create the possibility for transformation for ourselves and our communities." As she stepped away from the microphone, Robert was there, offering his arm, his eyes shining with a mixture of pride and something deeper that made Clara's heart quicken. Together, they had discovered that the invisible threads of kindness, when woven with intention and care, could create a tapestry strong enough to hold not just two once lonely souls, but an entire community. Have you ever encountered or known someone whose small act of kindness completely changed the trajectory of another person's life? Share your experience in the comments. That evening, as Clara and Robert sat on her balcony watching the sunset paint the city in gold, he reached for her hand. "I've been thinking," he said softly, "about invisible things that matter." Clara tilted her head. "Like what?" "Like how you fed a stranger every day without expecting anything in return. Like how David and Margaret never stopped looking for me, even when years had passed. Like how Thomas is trying in his way to bridge the distance." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Like how, at our age, we're supposed to be winding down our lives, but instead we've found a new beginning." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, this man who had been lost and found again. "New beginnings can happen at any age," she murmured, "as long as we remain visible to each other." As dusk settled over the city, lights began to blink on in windows across the skyline, each one representing lives and stories as complex and valuable as their own. Clara had once been as invisible as those distant lights, a solitary glow easily overlooked in the vastness of the city. Now she understood that visibility wasn't about being seen by everyone, but by being truly seen by someone. In the quiet of the gathering evening, Robert's hand tightened around hers. "Clara Whitman," he said, his voice holding all the poetry he'd once taught. "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible." Clara smiled, turning to meet his gaze. "We see each other now, and that makes all the difference." The next morning they would return to the foundation, continue their work of making the invisible visible again. But for now, in this moment, they simply sat together, two people who had found each other against all odds, creating light in what had once been darkness. Could there be any greater miracle than that? Congratulations. Type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel.